So today I want to go over how gearing is going to work in Diablo 4. And I want to keep this video focused on all the different gear rarities, possible roles, and how those are going to change once you get into the end game and start progressing through the world tiers. So to start off, we have 5 different rarities of gear. We have normal with no affixes. We have magic that can roll 1 to 2 affixes. We have rare that can roll 2 to 6 affixes. Then we have legendary that roll 4 affixes plus their legendary aspect. Then past that, we have unique items that aren't random rolled that are going to roll with 4 affixes and then their special power. But uniques are all statically rolled, so if you get one unique, it's always going to have the same affixes on it. Now gearing is going to change pretty significantly as you progress throughout the game. So once you first start off the game, you're only going to be able to obtain normal up to legendary items. You have to complete the main campaign, get to level 50, complete the first capstone dungeon, which will unlock you world tier 3, and that will allow you to start obtaining unique items as well. So you're not going to start getting unique items until you get into the end game. And likewise, rare items are going to change pretty significantly as well, because once you first start the game, rare items are only going to be able to roll with up to 3 affixes. But as you start to progress throughout the game and get into the end game, get into the higher world tiers, they will start to be able to roll with more affixes on them. Now this is a part of gearing that we're not 100% sure on, because the amount of affixes that could roll on rare items has actually changed multiple times throughout the development of Diablo 4. Now it currently seems like rares will be able to roll up to 6 when you're in the highest world tier at the very end game, but we're still not actually 100% sure about that either. But unless there's some pretty significant changes, it seems like rare items are going to be some of the most important items in the game, specifically because of how many affixes they can roll. But that's not where the changes are going to end, because once you get into world tier 3 and then into world tier 4, you're actually going to get different tiers of these item rarities. So magic, rare, legendary, and unique can kind of be considered the base tier. But once you get into world tier 3, you can start to get sacred items, which are essentially a different tier of all of these base rarities. So you could get legendary sacred items, rare sacred items, and unique sacred items. Not actually sure if you're going to be able to get magic sacred items. Either way, I don't think that's going to be that important anyway. Now what sacred items are going to do is allow these items to roll higher than the base versions could. So if you could compare a base legendary item with a sacred legendary item, the sacred legendary item could roll higher than that base legendary could actually roll. And we don't know the exact amounts, but I have heard 20% throughout a round. So if that would end up to be true, sacred legendary items could at the max be 20% better than just normal legendary items. And that's going to end up meaning that these higher tiers of rarities will just end up being better if you can get those better rolls on them, because they're not necessarily always going to roll better than the base rarities will. But that's just in world tier 3, because once you get into world tier 4, you can also now get ancestral items, which work as just a higher tier past sacred. So now you would have base legendary items, you would have sacred legendary items, and then ancestral legendary items. And ancestral is going to work exactly the same as sacred. So now the stats on that ancestral item can roll higher than sacred can roll, but it doesn't mean it's always going to roll higher than sacred or normal legendary items. But there is one drawback with this, because you're not going to be able to take the legendary aspect from a base legendary and put that on, say, a sacred item. So if you wanted to put a legendary aspect on a sacred piece of rare gear, you would have to get a sacred legendary item, take the aspect off, and then put that on it. So these higher tiers of items are kind of clumped into the same pool, and you can't change legendary aspects between the different pools. And on top of all these changes, you'll also continue to be able to get new unique items as you progress higher into the world tiers. So once you get into world tier 3, that's where you can first start to obtain unique items. Once you get into world tier 4, there's also some new unique items that can only be obtained in world tier 4. Now these new unique items don't necessarily have to be sacred or ancestral. You just now have the possibility of getting any version of these new specific unique items. So speaking of legendaries, the legendary aspect system is going to be one of the most important parts of gearing in Diablo 4. So how the system is going to work is all legendary aspects or powers are going to randomly randomly roll on a designated set of gear pieces, and they're going to be split into 5 different categories. So for instance, offensive legendary powers are some of the strongest in the game, but these can only roll on amulets, weapons, gloves, or rings. And likewise, you have defensive powers that can only roll on shields, helms, chests, pants, and amulets. So every legendary power in the game randomly rolled on this designated set of gear pieces, but you're able to take any legendary item, take it to a specific NPC in the game called the occultist, and actually pull that legendary power off of that legendary item. It'll destroy that item and give you a one-time use legendary aspect that you're now able to go put in either a rare item or another legendary item. If you put it in a rare item, it just adds it to that rare item, keeps all the normal affixes it already had, turns it into a legendary, and you're good to go. If you put it on another legendary item, it just removes the legendary power from that item and adds the one you're adding to it. So this is going to end up meaning that once you get into the end game, the vast majority of your gear is going to be legendary gear. Whether this is just a legendary you found in the world and equipped it, or if you took a legendary power off a piece of gear and put it on, say, a rare item. And all of these legendary powers or legendary aspects have a roll range just like normal affixes do. So maybe a legendary power could roll from 10 to 30%. So that also means there's going to be a good amount of chase to get that perfect legendary aspect with the best roll it can get. And again, like mentioned, this is also going to progress once you get into World Tier 3 and 4, as you can't take a normal legendary power and put it in a sacred rare item. So you don't need to be saving every legendary item or power you get while you're progressing throughout the campaign, because you're not going to be able to use them and infuse them into sacred items anyway once you start your end game gearing. But there's also going to be another system tied into legendary aspects that's going to help you quite a lot as you're progressing through the game and getting into the end game. And this is called the Codex of Power. Now, how this is going to work is completing dungeons throughout the game is going to unlock you a codex in this Codex of Power. Now, codexes are a permanent version of different legendary powers or aspects, but this codex can be applied to infinite items. So once you unlock a codex, and say you unlock a codex that gives you a legendary aspect that's really good for your build, now no matter what, you can have that legendary power and apply to any piece of gear that you want. So you never have to go without having this specific legendary power as you progress throughout the game. And a pretty big upside of this is that these codexes can be applied to any different tier of gear. So you could apply the codex power to normal items, sacred items, or ancestral items. But there's 2 big downsides with the system. The codex does not have all legendary powers in the game. I think it only has around half of them, and I think it currently has around 115 powers, so you're not going to be able to get every legendary power in the codex, and the codex gives you the weakest version of those legendary powers. So like I mentioned, legendary powers can roll like normal affixes, so maybe if one rolled 10 to 30%, the codex would give you the 10% version. It would always be the lowest roll, so even if you had the codex power, which was the legendary power you wanted, you would still want to be farming for legendary pieces of gear to give you a higher rolled version of that specific power. Now, we couldn't go over gearing without going more in depth on uniques, because these are going to be the ultimate chase items in the game, and these are going to be incredibly rare. You can only start obtaining these once you've gotten into World Tier 3, and you're still not even able to obtain all uniques, because once you get into World Tier 4, you now have more uniques you can obtain. And these things are going to be ridiculously rare. The developers said that most players should only expect to get 2 to 3 of these per season. Now, seasons are going to last for 3 months. So for most players, you're only going to be getting around 1 unique item per month. Now, we don't know the exact playtime that would entail, but these are still going to be ridiculously rare. But that also means that uniques are going to be just incredibly strong. And a lot of these uniques are going to be so strong that they actually allow builds to exist. And we've actually gotten some really cool examples. So one of the most recent ones I showed off was the returning Shaco, or what's actually called the Harlequin Crest. And this is a unique helmet that can be used by any class. And the special of this is that you gain 10 to 20% damage reduction at all times. That's the specific roll on this item. And then you gain +4 ranks to all skills. That's every single skill for that class, which is kind of ridiculous, and I could very much see this being nerfed. And this was being shown off as an ancestral Ancestral item. Presumably this is one of the uniques you can only obtain while being in World Tier 4, but the power of this is completely ridiculous because keep in mind, getting a plus skill rank to a skill means you can just use that skill. You don't have to put any skill points in that skill to actually use that if you have a plus skill rank to it on a piece of gear. This gives you +4 skill ranks to every single skill, meaning you could just use any skill combination you want just off of this helmet. And how the skills in Diablo 4 scale is you're getting around a 10% damage increase per skill point put in. So if you're already using a skill that you have 5 points in, this is going to give you 40% damage increase on every one of your main skills. And there's going to be just tons of additional unique items. I think there's going to be over 100 unique items, either class specific or general use, on the launch of the game. And again, like mentioned before, these uniques are going to be statically rolled. So if you look at the Harlequin crest, it gives maximum life, cooldown reduction, resource generation, and an increase to all stats as its normal affixes. This helmet will always roll with those affixes, but they still have a roll range. So it's not always going to give the same amount of life or the same amount of cooldown reduction. So with all these different gearing systems tied together, you're going to have a ton of different options for what pieces of gear you want to use for your specific builds. And there's going to be a decently laid out path of progression as you go throughout the campaign, and then as you start getting into the end game and going through World Tier 3 and World Tier 4. But that's pretty much all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.